The Chapters of Everley, Chronicle 1, The Night Sky Inferno. Prologue. The fog was thick and heavy on the night air. Henry was walking at a brisk pace, determined to be out of the cold and the fog and in his house beside a warm fire sooner rather than later, although he had a stop to make first. The prickly night air, thick with moisture, was lapping against his skin and catching in his bushy black hair as he quickened his step. He could still hear the sounds of the harbour, and when he turned to look, he could just about see the glowing coming from the lighthouse. He silently hoped there were no ships coming in tonight, lest they not see the light through the fog and flounder against the jagged rocks of Shift-Craw Point and drop to the icy depths of the frozen northern waters of the Northern Territories of Alamisal. Henry set that thought aside and bounded for home. But first he had to drop by his sister's house to drop off the last of the fish that he caught that day before he could get out of the cold for good. But his sister probably had some hot food for him to enjoy, which would be worth the extra walk. The house was crumbling, falling apart. The windows were painfully thin, the thatch roof looked worse for wear, and there were deep cracks in the stone from years of disrepair. But all the houses in this area, thudded together with stone and mortar, were in decay. Henry was carrying a small wooden crate of beautiful haddock, caught fresh that afternoon. He tucked it under one arm and stepped inside without knocking. "Hello?" he called as he stepped inside. "Uncle Henry!" screamed Bretta, his 6-year-old niece, as she bounded towards him, arms open wide, ready for the customary bear hug she knew was coming. Henry placed the crate of fish on the floor and readily scooped up the girl in his arms, strengthened from years of hauling nets full of fish and sailing his own small boat with a crew of just 3 other men. He could feel the small swordfish pendant he had gotten her a couple of years earlier digging into his chest. "Ooh, Uncle Henry, you stink," the small child explained. "That's not me, Bretta, that's the fish," Henry protested, pointing to the crate on the floor. "No, you too," she insisted, confirming her suspicions by planting her head under his square jaw, venturing into his big black beard and smelling her uncle's woolen tunic, recoiling at the foul odour. Henry hugged her closer, causing the little girl to squirm and giggle as she struggled to free herself from her captor's smelly grip. Henry laughed and put her back down as he saw the girl's mother, Keegan, walk in. "I thought that was you," she said. Henry closed the door and picked up the fish. He walked over to his sister and handed her the crate. "Here, we got a nice haul today." "Oh yeah? It's picking up again?" Keegan began to unload the fish into a bucket of icy water. "There's some beef stew in the pot. Help yourself," she offered. "Yeah, those new nets you and the girls weaved are a dream." "Beef?" Henry asked hesitantly. "You come into some money?" Keegan gave her brother a knowing look. "As far as you need to know, it's beef." Henry snorted a laugh and filled a bowl with stew. "I'm going to take this back with me, if that's okay." "You sure? Bretta has been begging to go to the lighthouse, so we're taking her tonight. You could come with us," she suggested. "The lighthouse? You going up there at night, in this fog?" Henry inquired, surprised. "Yeah, Davil and Nenny from down the way are coming too, with their little boy Morris," she explained as she placed the last of the haddock in the bucket and stood up. "I know Bretta would love to spend more time with you." "I'm tired, I'm dirty, and my fingers smell of fish," he said, floating his hands in front of Keegan's repulsed face. "And I've just come from that way. I don't want to go back tonight," the fisherman rebuffed. "And it's stupidly cold out there. The view will pretty much be fog." "Do you want to piss all over the things your niece wants to do for fun?" Keegan scolded. "Why does she want to go there so badly?" Henry responded, dodging the dagger. Keegan was always surprised by her brother's ability to bend to the love and affection of those around him, probably the reason he could never hold down a decent woman. Not that the indecent ones stuck around for long either. "Why? Because she wants to see what her favourite uncle does and where he brings the fish from," Keegan said as she moved over to her brother. "And because Bo Everley Reborn couldn't make me allow her on your boat," she smiled. "Well, she won't be seeing much tonight, lighthouse or boat," Henry said flatly. After the customary goodbyes and kisses, Henry Bayler made his way home through the muddy streets, clutching a bowl of stew. As he walked, he briefly considered making his way to the Forgotten Alley and enjoying the company of one of the girls working the many brothels there. Kendra, or Lauren, would certainly show him a good time. Kendra with her long blonde hair and charming smile, or Lauren with their devilish brown eyes and enormous tits he could enjoy for hours. Although Kendra had seemed less and less her happy self when he paid for her attention. In fact, the last time he visited that particular brothel, Henry got the distinct feeling that she was a few words and a ball of courage away from asking for his help. But it wasn't until he got home that he realised that she might have been about to ask, and he hadn't returned for a couple of weeks. No, home was his decision. After walking for 15 minutes or so, he turned to where he thought the harbour and beyond it the lighthouse were, but it was pointless. The fog seemed to have gotten thicker whilst he had been out of it. The biting chill that came with it was new to him. Even as a fisherman, he had worked the lines for 17 years. He had never experienced fog like this. He could feel it clatter against his cheeks as he guided through it. It strangled the life out of the moonlight, attempting to break through. It suffocated the light from the oil lanterns that dotted the street's edge, an initiative that had gotten a mayor elected several decades earlier, even though the majority of them had never been lit, keeping up with the tradition that had begun even before the mayor that had been sworn into office finished his first term. That annoyed Henry. Everyone knew there were people paid to light the damn things. They just didn't do a good job of it. Henry was a firm believer in doing your job properly and to completion. It was always someone else's silver that you were banking, after all. As soon as he was in the house with the door firmly locked, he put the bowl on the table and threw 2 small logs into the fireplace. A small metal box with a panel missing and an ugly, blackened stone chimney. He got the fire going and sat down to warm himself and rid the wintry cold from his aching body. His hands were cupped around his mouth, trying to keep them warm with his breath. He remembered Keegan's beef stew. Beef, he thought. It was far more likely to be rat or dog than it was beef. Cows were few and far between around the town of Grillam, and the closest farms were more likely to be dairy farmers. You were more likely to see someone toiling in the salt or copper mines than rearing an animal or sowing a field. It was usually only the custodians of the treasury, the mayor, or more affluent merchants that could actually afford to transport beef in on any sort of regular basis. There were pig and chicken farmers, but a lot of the local residents just used the animals loitering in the local environment, the pork and ham and chicken making its way east, west and south instead. Keegan lived in an area with a lot of women with kids, but not many men. War and glory, disease and back-breaking work had taken their men away from them. They relied on each other and family. Keegan's husband, Bretta's father, worked in the salt mines a few miles east of Grillam. He had been working in a cavern that was being excavated too quickly to be done safely, and the tragically inevitable happened. The roof gave way, crushing and suffocating everyone in it and the cavern above. Keegan was strong though, and managed to keep enough coppers coming in from selling small portions of the fish Henry caught and working occasionally as a seamstress to keep Bretta fed and clothed. Henry was proud of her for that. If you weren't blessed with the name of nobility or wealth, you were struggling to survive in Alamisal. Keegan had always been strong, and she was passing that trait on to her daughter. Bretta had taken the loss of her father surprisingly well. She pined for him for a few weeks after his death, but soon after began to get on with her little life, dealing with the grief as only a 4-year-old could. And she was a smart girl, reading the books the Horizons had gave her that were far beyond her years, books that would be beyond the realms of comprehension for Henry. He didn't like to impose himself on them though. Keegan's husband, Worrell, was a good man, and Henry respected him, so he didn't want to seem like he was trying to become the man of the house. The absurdity of such testosterone-fueled logic was lost on Henry. Men had a place, women had a place. Keegan defied any such forces, however. A reason why she could control her brother, Henry supposed. Until it came to other women, he thought with a wry smile. He poured the stew into a small iron pot and then hooked it onto a thin skewer, laying above the fire. It soon began to bubble away at his modest house. In truth, it was closer to a hut. It only had 2 actual rooms, filled with the sultry aromas of leek, onion, carrot, and well, all he needed to know that it was beef, and Keegan's word was law. Not that he'd ever tell her that to her face. He grabbed a spoon, wiped it on a dirty bit of cloth, and knelt down in front of the fire to sample his sister's cooking. A loud slurp was followed by, It tasted good. It tasted very good. Almost better than Ma's. Almost, he thought with a grin, as he removed the meal from the fireplace and poured it back into the bowl. Happily, full of stew, and tired from a long and hard day's work, Henry lay down on the bench covered with a thin cloth. It was old and falling apart, but it did the job. Laying across it, he could see out of the small window next to the door. The view was dirty white and grey colour. The fog was so thick that he could see it moving gently with the wind. That's odd, he thought, as his eyes became heavier and he allowed himself to drift into a much-needed slumber. Seconds later, he was snoring, loud and contently. Henry woke up to the sound of what seemed to be distant screaming and yelling. Still groggy, he didn't fully acknowledge what he was hearing. He rubbed his eyes and sat up. His neck was stiff and painful from lying on the bench at an awkward angle. His arms and back were aching too, but he was used to experiencing that on a daily basis. He stood up and stretched and let out a loud groan. At this point that the noises outside began to register in his brain. He turned and stepped out of the house and into an unusually crowded street. There were some people still in a state of panic, rushing about and screaming about something. Everyone else, however, was stood, staring, all in the same direction. Their mouths were wide open, shock and fear peppered their faces. Henry saw the man who lived in the house opposite standing amongst the crowd of statues. He walked over to him. "Gent, what the hell's going on?" he asked. The tall, slender man just stood there for a few seconds before turning his face to his neighbour, but there were no words. Henry took the blank look in his stride and looked around to see what everyone was looking at. As soon as he was facing north, he saw what it was. The lighthouse was burning. Flames had engulfed the mighty structure. The fog was thick. It had waned a little during Henry's nap, but visibility was close to naught. But not that towering inferno. Faint, but definite in the distance. "The lighthouse! The lighthouse is on!" he started. "Fire, I know," Gent finished, eerily devoid of emotion. That's when Henry had a sudden and horrific realization. It was a thought that turned his stomach into a pit of acid and his face almost turned green. "How long ago did it go up?" he demanded, grabbing Gent by the arm. "What?" he responded, turning to Henry. "The damn lighthouse!" he screamed. "When did the lighthouse go up in flames, Gent? Tell me!" "About 20 minutes ago, I guess." Aye. "Who did this? Why?" Gent stammered. "Oh no," Henry said, as he bolted for the harbour. Henry was running as fast as his legs could go. He was urging every muscle in his body to push itself. He made a left turn and then a right, and lost his footing on the mud that caked the streets. He got back up and kept on going without losing a beat. He had no time to waste. "Oh God, don't let them have made it to the lighthouse." The blazing structure was getting closer, and he could swear that he could almost hear the flames. But after taking a right down Ladywell Lane, he began to hear the sound of the harbour. Only this time, it was not the hustle and bustle of the people unloading and loading ships and selling their catches of the day, but people screaming, crying and shouting orders. The fog was still so cold that it was starting to freeze the thin layer of sweat beginning to unfold on Henry's face. But only one thought dominated his mind. His legs were screaming for relief, but he wouldn't let up. He passed Fisherman's Row and was running parallel to the harbour. He could see the lighthouse burning in the distance. It was still so far. Even though it was paved here, the stone was always slick with seawater, and the fog tonight had encased it in a film of thin ice. It had become harder to run on than the mud, which had become a little bit more stable. After a few more yards, Henry could run no more. His arms and legs were drained after a 12-hour day at sea, and now commanding a break from the brutal sprint that they were being put through, and he could feel his foot going onto the slippery stone. He came to a total standstill as his chest heaved in the air it craved. He stood and looked at the lighthouse. What was happening? The giant structure had stood fast and strong for longer than anyone knew. It predated the town itself, if you followed the theory that it was not originally built for a guide for incoming ships, but more likely as a lookout tower. And now here it was, a prison of hellfire, and trapped inside could be. I couldn't finish the thought. But it did get him moving again. His determination grew, and with fists balled so tight they broke skin, he launched forward. Ice be damned and fatigue be damned, he was not stopping again. His muscles were tired of this game, but Henry wasn't stopping. He finally passed the harbour and made his way along the long, winding path that eventually led to his destination. He made the last sharp turn that let him know he was getting closer. Henry didn't really feel it in his mad panic, but the fog was getting physically thicker as he got closer to his destination. He did, however, notice the introduction of smoke to the grey haze already surrounding him. It wafted straight up his nose and made him gag, slowed him down, bringing him to a meander as he tried to fight through the plumes of smoke now plummeting towards him with a growing southerly wind. And before he knew what hit him, a monstrous firestorm was raging in front of him. Already, the once white stones of the behemoth were largely blackened and beginning to crack. The heat emanating from it was starting to burn his skin. He backed up, shielding his face with his bulky forearm. He manoeuvred around the perimeter until he bumped into someone. Both jumped with shock, but quickly regained themselves. "Who are you?" the stranger yelled over the noise of the Inferno. "I think my sister and niece..." Henry nearly choked on the words. "My sister and niece might be in there," he shouted back, pointing at the lighthouse for emphasis. The expression on the face told Henry all he needed to know. He took a deep breath. "Are you sure they're in there?" the man asked. That stopped Henry in his tracks. Was he sure? Suddenly Henry realised he'd made an incredible mistake. He was truly bewildered and angry at how stupid he'd been. Why had he not checked that they weren't still home first? He didn't know what to do. Stay or leave. If he ran to Keegan's house, would he have strength to make it back here if they weren't there? He could check the house of the people that they were supposed to be going with. Not that he knew which house it was. But what if he stayed? He reasoned they would still be there when the fire was out. If he stayed and they were trapped in there, what could he even do to save them? "Is anyone trying to put the fire out?" he asked the patient stranger. "How? There are a few guys up by the water's edge filling pails with water, but it's not going to do a damn bit of difference," he exasperated. "How could it? We need rain." The statement was a dagger in the heart. He stood there gazing, not knowing what to do. He refused to accept that they were inside. Bretta had been a bad girl and pestered Mummy too much, and was not allowed to go and play in the lighthouse tonight. They were both safely at home, both sulking for very different reasons. But he knew he had to stay here. He was too exhausted to run to Keegan's and then back if the worst was confirmed. But he couldn't stand and do nothing. He slowly staggered his way through the fog. He realised the heat of the flames were helping to thin it out. This damn fog. What the hell was going on? He'd never experienced anything like it. He found a small band of men hopelessly trying to nullify the flames with 3 pails of water. It was a fruitless task, but Henry wanted to be busy. He carefully climbed down the rocky edge and began to fill the pail with water. Handing it up was tediously difficult through the velvet curtain of grey. By first light, the group of 5 men had grown to 30 or 40. The original band of 5 were all thoroughly exhausted, Henry especially, and had more or less passed out on the ground where they stood. As the sun broke through the eastern horizon, one of the senior townspeople came over to the men and kneeled down beside Henry. He gently shook him on the shoulder. Henry woke up immediately, startled. He saw the man at his side, balding, but with a thick black moustache. He worked for the people who ran the salt mines. "What is it?" Henry asked, immediately realizing he didn't need to shout to be heard. His whole body shifted round to his right, and there stood the black and charred shell of the oldest structure this side of Harper River. The fog had dissipated somewhat, but it was still thick and looming in the air. "We're thinking it's safe enough to try and move inside the lighthouse now. You want to come and see?" the townsman said. Henry nodded and stood up. His back cracked in 3 different places as he got to his feet. Henry followed the mustachioed man towards a group of the other town representatives, including the mayor, dressed as only the rich could. New silk, fresh velvet in the latest cut. The others were a mixture of men in working clothes from the mines or the ships or surrounding mills and storehouses. They eyed Henry with a mixture of suspicion. He was just a fisherman with no affiliation to the bigger merchants, after all, and sorrow. "Are we ready then?" asked one of the men as Henry approached them. Henry had no words. He just nodded. "Be careful. We don't know just how unstable it is in there, and with the fog, watch your step as you make your way through," the seemingly more senior of the working men said, before turning to the man to his left and gesturing with his hand. "Mr. Sedre, lead the way." The mayor nodded and followed the order, leading the others tentatively inside. Most of the men stumbled a little as they tried to step over the small lip at the front door. The fog had penetrated inside here too, but it was much thinner, adding to the smoke to create a hollow, eerie atmosphere. Each step of each man reverberated around the tall, steaming shell. The majority of the inside fittings were made of wood. The stairs, the furniture, the support beams were all made of dark oak, except now they were only black carbon. And it was piled high, having tumbled and crashed at some point during the blaze. The only thing left in place was the giant round granite column in the centre that the lighthouse beacon was placed on and set aflame. The men began pairing off and trying to sift through the rubble. Henry did so on his own. With every thrust of his arms into the debris, he grunted. He didn't care that his energy was sapped. He didn't care that the pain shooting through his body increased with every shift of the broken innards of the lighthouse. There was only one goal, one purpose, and only one way to achieve it. "Turning, sir! I think we've found something!" It had been a brow-soaking 20 minutes of work when someone finally spoke. All the heads in the room turned. Henry stood up slowly as several other men walked over to inspect the discovery. Their faces were grim. Henry didn't even need to wait for them to turn and face him. He dropped the broken plank in his hand and walked swiftly over. The world began to slow down and swallow him as he approached the grisly discovery. He was hoping against hope. His entire world crumbled viscerally in front of him. There, in front of him, was the scorched remains of 2 people. One, an adult, cradling the other, a child, with a small swordfish pendant necklace. It was distorted in the heat of the fire, but distinctive in its design unique to these parts. 5 men had begun the effort the previous night to put out the fire. Henry joined them. A further 10 men had come overnight to begin helping to search through the wreckage. All 15 would never forget the dark howl Henry bellowed as he saw the crushing sight of Keegan and Bretta. He collapsed to his knees and wailed. He hammered his fist against the broken glass and shredded wood. The others just stood around and watched as he pummeled debris into pulp and ash. Grillam was a tough town that bred tough people. None of them knew what to say. They were stunned with a mix of horror and fear. Everyone in the lighthouse had seen death, but none had felt it sting so much. To see a man they'd known their whole lives, or at least his, to see a man they'd known to be a dedicated fisherman and efficient contributor to the town's survival, crumble so instantly and viciously was a shredding moment. "Why them? Henry stammered through raged breath and stinging tears. Why did they have to be alone? They all felt guilt for something that they knew was beyond their control, but none of them felt anything close to the level of guilt that Henry was beginning to swarm with. A young woman and a beautiful little girl were dead, and it was his fault.